On a warm afternoon in September of 1848, in a small Vermont town called Cavendish, a 25-year-old railway foreman was doing a job he had done 100 times before. His name was Phineas Gage, and by every account that survives him, he was capable, well-liked, and careful, the kind of man a company trusted to run a demanding crew and get the job done without incident. His work that day was routine, in the way that dangerous things often are right up until the moment they aren't. He was preparing to blast a section of rock to make way for a new railway line. The process required boring a hole into the stone, pouring in blasting powder, adding a fuse, and then packing sand on top using a long iron rod, a tamping iron, 3.5 feet long, over an inch thick, weighing more than 13 pounds, tapered to a point at one end. The job of the tamping iron was simply to compress the material down into the hole so the blast would go where it was supposed to. Gage had done this exact motion more times than anyone could count, but on this particular afternoon, something interrupted the sequence. A moment's distraction, perhaps someone calling out behind him, and he began tamping down the rod before the sand had been added. The iron struck the rock directly against exposed blasting powder. The explosion that followed did not go outward into the rock. It went upward in the only direction the tamping iron could travel once the blast ignited beneath it, and Phineas Gage, standing directly over the hole, was in its path. The iron rod shot upward with tremendous force, entering just below his left cheekbone, passing behind his left eye, driving through the front of his brain, and exiting through the top of his skull. It landed, according to witnesses, more than 25 yards away, coated in blood and brain tissue. What happened next is one of the strangest and most quietly astonishing facts in the history of medicine. Phineas Gage did not die. He did not even lose consciousness for more than a few moments. Within minutes he was talking. He was thrown backward by the force of the blast, but according to the men working with him, he sat up almost immediately and, in a detail that has been retold so many times it's become almost mythical, but which comes from first-hand accounts recorded shortly after the event, he was able to speak coherently within minutes and was even able to walk, with some assistance, to an ox cart that carried him into town. He was taken to see a local physician named John Martin Harlow, a young country doctor who had never treated anything remotely like the injury sitting in front of him. Gage, sitting upright in a chair, greeted the doctor and reportedly told him, with what witnesses described as startling composure, that he thought there was business enough for the doctor to attend to. A man with a hole clean through his skull, making something close to a joke about his own condition. Harlow began the examination and found what he would later describe in careful clinical language: a wound at the top of the head, large enough that the pulsations of the brain beneath it were visible, bone fragments driven inward, and a track of destruction running down through the frontal lobe to the point of exit below the eye. By any reasonable expectation of 19th century medicine, this was not a survivable injury. Infection alone, in an era before antiseptic practice was widely understood, should have killed him within days, even if the initial trauma didn't. For a while, it nearly did. Gage developed a severe infection in the days that followed, drifted in and out of a delirious semi-comatose state, and at one point, Harlow believed he was watching his patient die. Family members were told to prepare for the worst. A coffin, according to some accounts, was measured for him. And then, against every expectation available to the medicine of the time, Phineas Gage began to recover. Slowly, over the course of about 2 months, the infection cleared, the wounds closed, and the man, who had been given up for dead, began to walk, speak, and function again, physically remarkably close to how he had before the accident. His vision was permanently lost in the left eye, and he carried a visible scar and a deep depression in his skull for the rest of his life. But he could walk, he could talk. His memory, by all accounts, was intact. He could recall the accident itself and the years before it without apparent gaps. In the narrowest physical sense, Phineas Gage had survived one of the most catastrophic brain injuries ever documented. But it's what came after the physical recovery that turned this story from a medical curiosity into something that would reshape how an entire field of science understood the human mind. The people who had known Gage before the accident began to notice that the man who had returned to them was not, in the ways that mattered most, the same man who had left. Before the accident, by every account collected from friends, employers, and family, Phineas Gage had been reliable, even-tempered and shrewd, a man with what his contemporaries called a well-balanced mind, someone his employers considered among the most efficient and capable foremen in their service. After the accident, that description no longer applied. Dr. Harlow, who continued to follow Gage's case for years afterward, wrote what would become one of the most quoted passages in the early history of neuroscience. He described Gage as fitful, irreverent, and given to the grossest profanity, which had not been part of his character before. He was impatient with any advice or restraint that conflicted with his own desires, obstinate, capricious, and vacillating, devising many plans for future action which were no sooner arranged than they were abandoned. In Harlow's words, words that have echoed through more than a century and a half of medical literature, his mind had changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. The company that had once considered him one of their most trustworthy foremen refused to give him his job back, not because he was physically incapable, but because they no longer trusted his judgment. The steady, careful man they had known was gone, replaced by someone impulsive, erratic, and difficult to work alongside. What happened to Phineas Gage after this is a quieter, sadder story than the explosion itself, and one that took much longer to piece together than the accident that started it. Unable to hold on to his old career, he drifted through a series of jobs over the following years. For a period, in one of the stranger footnotes in medical history, he was actually put on display, exhibited alongside his tamping iron as something between a medical exhibit and a sideshow curiosity, a living demonstration of the impossible thing that had happened to him. Later, he worked at a livery stable in New Hampshire. Later still, he spent nearly 7 years driving a stagecoach in Chile, work that some historians believe suggests his condition may have stabilized or partially improved over time, since the job required a level of routine and responsibility that would have been difficult for the volatile man Harlow had described. Eventually, his health began to decline. He moved to San Francisco to be near his mother and sister, and in his final years, he began experiencing epileptic seizures, a common long-term consequence of severe frontal lobe injury, though understood only vaguely at the time. In May of 1860, nearly 12 years after the accident that should have killed him instantly, Phineas Gage died following a series of increasingly severe seizures. He was 36 years old. For years, his story existed mostly as a medical oddity, a case written up by Harlow, filed away, referenced occasionally as a strange example of survival against impossible odds. But as neuroscience began to develop as a serious discipline in the decades that followed, researchers returned again and again to the details of Gage's case, because buried inside this one man's tragedy was a discovery that the mind of the 19th century wasn't yet prepared to fully grasp. Before Gage, the prevailing understanding of the brain, to the extent one existed at all, treated it largely as a single, undifferentiated organ, the seat of thought and personality as a whole, rather than a structure made up of specialized regions, each responsible for different functions. Some early researchers had begun to suspect otherwise, but there was little hard evidence to prove that something as intangible as personality, judgment, or impulse control could be tied to a specific physical location inside the skull. Phineas Gage became, unintentionally and at enormous personal cost, the first significant piece of evidence that it could. The tamping iron had passed almost entirely through his frontal lobes, the region of the brain sitting just behind the forehead, while leaving the areas responsible for language, memory, and basic motor function largely untouched. And what changed in him afterward wasn't his ability to think, remember, or speak. It was something more specific and, in some ways, more fundamental. His ability to regulate impulse, to plan coherently, to weigh consequences, to behave in a way consistent with his own long-term interests and the expectations of people around him. The very things that make up what we casually call character. It would take more than a century of additional research, brain imaging technology that Harlow could never have imagined, careful studies of other patients with frontal lobe damage, a far more sophisticated understanding of neural networks, before scientists could explain with real precision why Gage's particular injury produced this particular transformation. Today, the frontal lobes, and especially a region called the prefrontal cortex, are understood to play a central role in exactly the functions that seem to vanish from Gage's personality: impulse control, long-term planning, social judgment, the ability to weigh an immediate desire against a future consequence. In a very real sense, the region of Gage's brain that the tamping iron destroyed was the region most responsible for the parts of him that made him, in Harlow's words, recognizably himself. There's a modern postscript to this story worth sitting with, because it complicates the version most commonly told. For decades, the popular account of Gage's life ended with Harlow's description of the no longer Gage personality: impulsive, foul-mouthed, unable to hold a job, treated as his permanent state for the rest of his life. But later, historical research, particularly work done by a psychologist named Malcolm Macmillan, who spent years tracing Gage's life after the accident, uncovered evidence suggesting the picture was more complicated. Gage's ability to hold a demanding, responsible job as a stagecoach driver in Chile for close to 7 years, a role requiring navigation, scheduling, and dealing directly with passengers over difficult terrain, doesn't fit neatly with the image of a permanently and totally incapacitated man. It's possible, some researchers now believe, that Gage's brain found ways to partially compensate over time, that the sharpest edges of his personality softened as the years went on. Even if he never returned fully to the man he'd been before September of 1848. This matters because the real lesson of Phineas Gage was never simply damage this part of the brain and get this specific personality. The brain, even a damaged one, doesn't work in such tidy mechanical terms. What Gage's case actually opened up was a much larger and more unsettling question: one that neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy are all in different ways still trying to answer. If a rod of iron passing through a specific few inches of tissue could take a cautious, dependable man and produce someone his own friends no longer recognized, then how much of what any of us consider our unshakable, essential self is actually built on something as fragile and physical as a few cubic inches of tissue behind our foreheads? We like to talk about character as though it's something separate from the body, a soul, a will, a fixed essence that exists independently of anything as mundane as biology. Phineas Gage's story doesn't answer the philosophical question of whether that's true, but it does something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. It shows with brutal physical clarity just how thin the line can be between the version of ourselves we take for granted and the version that emerges when the machinery behind it is altered, even slightly, even in a single afternoon. Gage never got to choose the change that happened to him. One moment he was a careful, dependable foreman doing a job he'd done 100 times. The next, an accident of physics and geology rewired something in him that no one at the time had the language to fully describe, and the people who loved him were left to grieve a man who was still technically standing right in front of them. His skull, along with the tamping iron that passed through it, is preserved today at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School. Two physical objects still sitting side by side more than a century and a half later, as quiet evidence of the moment modern neuroscience first had to reckon with an idea it has never fully stopped grappling with since, that who we are might be more contingent, more physical, and more fragile than we would ever choose to believe.